This podcast contains our own personal views, not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Welcome back to Coronial, everyone. I'm Alice.
I'm Emma.
And I'm Georgie.
And so this week we're going to be going into part 2 of the Thredbo disaster inquest. So in today's episode, I'm going to be taking you through the development of Thredbo, the construction of the water main and the retaining wall, and the engineering cause of the landslide.
Last episode, we covered the Alpine Way and the foreseeable risks of there being a landslide.
Yeah, the construction of the Alpine Way and history of landslides in the area.
And a long history of known issues that were never fixed.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go through the development of Thredbo to start with. When the Alpine Way was actually being built in the 50s.
Yes.
Yep. Anton Sponer identified a site between Alpine Way and Thredbo River, which he thought would make a good spot for an alpine resort, partly because the road went through New South Wales to Victoria, and this meant more tourists.
Yay! Also, who was Anton Sponer?
They didn't really go into who he was, just that he was a guy who thought this was a good development place.
Okay.
In the 1950s, the Kosciuszko Chairlift and Thredbo Hotel Syndicate, now referred to as the Syndicate, was formed to develop a resort at Thredbo.
But now it also just sounds like the mafia.
It does a little bit, yeah. In early 1957, the Syndicate talked with Snowy Mountain Hydroelectric Authority to obtain its assistance to construct an access track from the Alpine Way to the Thredbo River, and they agreed to build that road. So that was essentially going sort of down the middle of where Thredbo would be to get from the Alpine Way down to the river.
Yeah. Okay.
In November 1957, the Minister for Lands entered into an agreement with the Syndicate. The minister would grant the Syndicate a 99-year lease over the land, which became Thredbo Village, as long as they completed building of hotels and a chairlift. So this lease was assigned to Kosciuszko Thredbo Limited, referred to as KTL, in January of 1958. Yeah. So they were the first sort of holders of this lease. By 1959, the Kosciuszko State Park was so heavy with development that a park superintendent was appointed, with a couple of rangers and outdoor staff to assist. In 1961, a full-time secretary was appointed. The members of the Kosciuszko State Park Trust were varied and included representatives of the Department of Lands, Treasury, Tourism and Soil Conservation, the Forestry Commission, political and local government representatives of the community around the area of the park, and Sir Garfield Barwick. They didn't have any experts, but they were assisted by a few honorary experts in architecture, surveying and engineering. These experts were part of the Park Development Committee, along with the superintendent and the assistant trustee. They were responsible for supervising the subdivisions and assessing building development applications. So they're all involved in the actual development of the area.
Yeah, and I guess it would have been a massive undertaking, right?
Yeah, and they're building it from nothing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's in a remote location as well.
Yeah.
Like it's not an easy access.
Yep. The first area of Thredbo to be developed was to the west of the landslide site. In mid-1958, KTL decided to develop a second subdivision to the east, which ended up being the landslide site, which was much steeper than the first site.
Mm-hmm.
One of the founding directors of KTL recalled that any boggy or marshy-looking land was thought of as suspect, and he knew it was unstable. He said that one of the areas considered unstable was the landslide site.
Wait, why would you then decide to develop on it?
We get
Or
there.
near it.
Okay.
The chairman of KTL asked the Snowy Mountain Hydroelectric Authority for an opinion on the stability of the hillside of the proposed second subdivision. The engineering geologist found two areas he associated with instability. Number one was a creek between the area where Winterhouse and Pindari lodges were later built, which Culvert 138 drained into. The second was a small valley with two parallel streams, which was where Carinya and Bin Badin were ultimately built.
Right.
The Alpine Way was not referred to in the report as posing a threat to the development below. So at that point, they knew parts of the hillside were possibly unstable, but they thought, and this was in 1958,
Yeah, okay.
there were no issues with the Alpine Way.
This is
Noted.
when the Alpine Way was being built as well,
Yeah.
so it
was still quite fresh.
young.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It hadn't gone past its 20-year lifespan yet.
Yeah. So where they actually built was fine. It was kind of only above that was unstable that only became more unstable over time.
No, it's more just that there were some areas that were considered unstable at the time that the geologist looked at them, but they weren't built on at that point. It was only later.
Yep. Okay.
People who were involved with Thredbo before Lend-Lease took over control of that area could recall that the site of the 1997 landslide was not available for lease. So an employee of KTL was responsible for showing people the lots which were available for lease in the Eastern Subdivision, and he was given a subdivision plan in 1959. He remembered that the landslide site was not given a lot number on that plan, and there was a marking on the plan which prohibited the use of the area.
Okay.
So it was off limits.
Yeah.
As of 1959.
Yeah.
One of the people who gave evidence at the inquest was someone who had inquired about available sites in Thredbo in late 1959. Her husband wanted a site with direct access from Alpine Way, and she was shown a plan in the village office. There was only one site available on Alpine Way, but she and her husband thought that the land to its east, which ended up being the landslide site, was more suitable. They were told it was not available because it was a landslip area. Lend-Lease said that she was confused about this, but the coroner found her to be a reliable witness. So Lend-Lease acquired the shares in KTL in about November 1961. In 1962, KT1, which was Kosciuszko Thredbo Proprietary Limited,
Yep.
very similar name, but we'll refer to it as KT1, entered a head lease with the trust, meaning that they were allowed to subdivide the area and to sublet lots for building, but any buildings themselves had to be approved by the trust.
Okay.
So we've got some subleasing going on.
Yes. Getting more complex.
Yeah. Lend-Lease commissioned a survey of the village, including the Eastern Subdivision area. The report prepared in December 1961 showed all areas in the Eastern Subdivision to carry lot numbers, except for the land between the Alpine Way and Bobuck Lane, where the 1997 landslide occurred.
Yep.
The surveyor stated that unnumbered plots among numbered plots on a plan would usually suggest that the site was not available to release to the public.
Yeah.
Makes sense. In mid-1962, the village manager prepared notes on each lot. The lot which was unnumbered in the surveyor's report between lot 60 on the east and lot 62 and 63 on the west, so it was referred to as lot 61. The manager's note stated, this lot extinguished, but so-called unbuildable slip area between lots 60 and 62/63, not necessarily unbuildable.
I think that there's a major error by leaving 61 unnumbered. They should have continued on 60 and 61 so that there was no availability to accidentally input 61. It implies it could gain a number. In which point it seems like it.
Yeah, the village manager was like, yeah, these other reports say that it's not buildable, but maybe it is. So no lot number appeared for that lot until January 1965.
Okay, so still another 3 years.
Yeah, until it's actually given a number.
Yeah.
In 1965, the superintendent considered that 4 lots adjacent Alpine Way, including the landslide site, should only be allowed after an investigation into the proximity of any building to the Alpine Way. He thought that the side slope near the 4 lots was critical to further road improvement.
Okay.
As in they may need to use that area to help keep the road.
Improve the road.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Department of Main Roads was asked by the Trust about the requirements for the likely event of it assuming some responsibilities for future improvement and maintenance of the Alpine Way, but the department said that it wasn't in a position to give any advice.
Okay.
Because they hadn't assumed responsibility. They hadn't even been asked to assume responsibility.
They never did assume responsibility anyway.
So then being asked what should be done with this, they're like, we can't say because we don't have any authority over it.
Yep.
The Eastern Subdivision was approved by the Trust in October 1965 with a caveat. Under no circumstances is any planning associated with the subdivision to extend beyond the boundaries of the head lease, as this aspect is of particular importance in relation to the boundaries adjacent to the Alpine Way, as future road improvement programs could be seriously impaired. So at this state, they were already thinking, okay, well, we need to reserve some land with the knowledge that we may need to upgrade this road.
That makes me wonder about, how there was that issue with the Tyroler Lodge and them wanting to be told to put a retaining wall up. Would have they technically then, under the leasing arrangement, actually been able to do that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Possibly
I don't know what
not.
the zoning map was like, but that proposed retaining wall would have been adjacent to the Alpine Way.
Yeah.
So obviously there was just a lack of knowledge all around.
Yeah. In August 1965, an architect working on townscaping became worried about Alpine Way. He wrote to the development's project and design engineering company that there were continuing signs of danger from subsidence along the Alpine Way and that drainage of the road should be improved. He advised that they should completely block the Schuss culvert to stop the subsidence.
Yeah.
After the landslide, this culvert was excavated and an old rotting piece of timber was found to have been placed across the inlet to stop water entering it.
Oh.
Okay.
So they were, essentially saying that that culvert would lead to subsidence because of the water that would be going through it.
Yeah.
So they blocked it up with a piece of timber.
Sure. It's not.
Doesn't seem ideal. Yeah.
Yeah.
In 1965, the Alpine Way was under the control of the Snowy Mountain Hydroelectric Authority, and if KT1 had done anything to the road, it might have been sued by the authority. So that's why KT1, even though, they're developing the area adjacent to it, they themselves couldn't do anything to the road.
Because they didn't own it.
Because they didn't own it, they might get sued for tampering with it. In November 1965, the village manager prepared a plan of the eastern subdivision and marked an area to the west of the landslide site as having had a slump, which was a subsidence of soil caused by natural springs in a particular wet area. He said it was an indication of instability and should be investigated, but didn't actually investigate it himself. A version of this plan, which included the word slide, was used in early 1967 for a submission to the Trust for a proposed extension to Beaubuck Lane to extend down the hill to connect with the road running through the lower village.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The plan was stamped approved by the Trust on the 20th of January 1967. So we've got multiple instances here of having plans that indicate areas of instability or slumps or slides.
Yeah, and that they are creating infrastructure essentially around that to try to avoid those areas.
I don't think avoid them, but just in the vicinity of those areas because they needed to because there was more and more development happening.
Yeah, okay.
As the eastern subdivision boundaries were refined, a reserve was marked out between the Schuss Lodge lot, which was lot 63, and the lot which Carinya was later built on. It was marked because the view was taken that the area was not desirable for building.
Okay.
The YMCA ski club from Canberra decided to build a lodge, which became Carinya. During the development of the plans in 1986, the village manager increased the width of the Carinya site to the west by about 5.5 metres to allow for the proposed building to be placed on the site.
Mm-hmm.
This meant that the building site included part of the area in that reserve that had been marked out.
Like number 61?
Oh, yeah, essentially encroaching onto
number 61.
Yeah, because that would have been the western side of it, which is the original site that got struck.
Yeah.
Yeah. The village manager was also a civil engineer and approved the site for construction. He relied on his own judgment and did not consider the site unstable. He assumed that the architect and the engineer who designed the lodge would make sure that it was safe and appropriate for that site.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. Sure, you probably shouldn't sell off land that is unstable. So it should be two-sided. If you're buying land, you shouldn't build on it if it's unstable. And you have the expertise to determine that.
It is, but I feel like the point is that even if there was no building on the land that was unstable, this slip could have potentially happened anyway. And it's the fact that there were buildings in the path of the slip. That's the issue. Like Carina Lodge, yes, there was part of it that was obviously built encroaching on the land that shouldn't have been built in, but that said, the whole lodge got
the whole
completely
lodge
wiped out, even the part of the lodge that was in the non-slip, and so did Bimbadeen, which I'm assuming, we haven't got to that yet, but I'm assuming was also in an area that was not zoned out for non-construction.
It was the below.
I think it would have been below because it's below Bobuck Lane.
Yeah.
Bimbadeen itself wasn't unstable, but
the
land above it.
And that's the thing, like, it doesn't just mean the part of the land that's unstable.
Yeah.
It's everything in the pathway of that unstable land that can be put at risk as well. And yes, obviously, if something is built on the unstable land, then that almost becomes like ammunition then.
Yeah, true.
As further material to fall down and cause an even worse landslide, which is what evidently happened here. Like, it may have been that if that part of Carina Lodge wasn't built on that unstable land, then potentially it wouldn't have then impacted Bimbadeen.
It didn't get dragged into.
Yeah, correct. But in any case, parts of the village that were not on zoned out areas were also impacted by the slip. So,
but was it the right decision to be like, oh, that's fine, we'll just extend this by 5 meters?
I don't think it is.
Yeah.
It's hard to say that ever could be.
Yeah.
And like, could they have just made it 5 meters less wide,
Or just redesign the lodge.
Yeah. Did the
use
lodge
the
need to be
appropriate
that
space.
wide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The building of the lodge began in October 1968 and was completed in May 1969. Formal approval of the plans and specifications by the National Parks and Wildlife Service was not granted until July 1969, after it had been finished being built.
Oh, so right. Hang on, so the approval to build the thing was granted after it had been built?
Yep.
I mean, how are you going to say no to
I was going
that?
to say, imagine if they were like, not granted.
Yep. So National Parks and Wildlife Service granted their approval of the plans in July 1969.
Yep.
In September 1969, the village manager wrote to the ski club to advise them of the National Park's approval and told them to complete the building application form and to submit it to the Snowy River Shire Council for approval.
For the building that already exists?
Yes.
Okay.
Formal approval of the specification was stamped on the documents by KT1 in October 1969.
Well, yeah, of course. They had to approve it.
Yep. The council wrote to the ski club in December 1971 stating that the building appeared to have been erected without council approval being obtained beforehand.
Appeared to have been.
It was.
Yeah, I was like, I think there's fair evidence that it was.
Yeah. The club submitted the application and approval was granted January 1972, 3 years after the building had been completed and occupied.
Excellent. That's...
So, like, they started building this before any approval of anything. In 1985, the club was looking into creating an extension to the lodge. By this time, a foundation inspection was needed to comply with building requirements. The Snowy Mountains Engineering Corporation performed an investigation of the site and subsurface conditions, and no danger to the lodge by Alpine Way was identified. But they were looking specifically at the foundation requirements of the building, not necessarily the area as a whole. As development of the village increased, the approach to geotechnical and/or stability issues was very haphazard and appeared to address a variety of geotechnical objectives. In some cases, stability was not even addressed, and the stability of the Alpine Way was not included in the assessments. This approach continued at least into the mid-1980s.
For a building that's built on the side of a hill?
Yes.
Okay.
In February 1975, a full-time clerk of works in the National Parks and Wildlife Service was appointed to supervise building activities within the park. By mid-1976, the clerk became aware of concerns of the National Park's Technical Services section that there was a real possibility of earth slips happening in such steep terrain, a not uncommon feature of the Alpine Way not far from the village.
And by 76, there'd been
there'd
multiple
been
road
at least the
Alpine
Winter
Way.
House,
Yeah.
landslide
As well. Yeah,
at that
okay.
point, yeah.
As he became more familiar with Thredbo, he became increasingly aware of the potential of works in the village to destabilise the slopes. He became aware of the vulnerability of the slope to subsidence, if exposed to water, and that these were geotechnical problems which required engineering solutions. Following the 1978 landslide, The clerk implemented a requirement that geotechnical reports be submitted in relation to building works and extensions to buildings on the Thredbo slope. So he was trying to do something about it.
Seems like the right way to go about building buildings.
Yes. In 1978, the National Parks and Wildlife Service considered a proposed development of a western subdivision in Thredbo to the west of the village adjacent to the Alpine Way. During that process, concern was expressed about the possibility of the instability of the Alpine Way above the area of the development, impacting adversely upon buildings below the road.
Okay, so this is kind of the first point that they've said, actually, what's above Thredbo is concerning.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
A geotechnical investigation requested by National Parks found marginal stability of the Alpine Way above the proposed development. The Department of Main Roads advised that the development of the western subdivision should not take place unless the Alpine Way was reconstructed, including drainage, so the subdivision did not proceed.
Okay. That's
So that's a good decision.
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
Yep. Despite this, there seemed to be no awareness that any works should be undertaken to remove the risk from the Alpine Way or to undertake a systematic review of potential slip zones within the village.
Yeah.
So they said, okay, you shouldn't develop here because there's issues with instability. The rest of it's fine, though. Or like, let's not even look at the rest of it.
Let's not investigate any further because it's already done.
Yeah.
So now we'll go into the construction of the water main. So in late 1982, the Secretary of the Board of Fire Commissioners wrote to KT1 advising that a fire main and hydrants should be installed on the Alpine Way above the Alpine Way village, essentially so that you could get firefighting water for nearby lodges and to help with bushfires if any happened.
Essentially just risk management in the sense that we've now got a developed area that wasn't previously developed. We should have services available should there be natural disasters.
We should have a water source readily available in case there's a fire.
Yeah, cool. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah. In December 1983, the National Parks and Wildlife Service was advised that KT1 intended to install a ring line on the north side of the Alpine Way that summer. The water main was constructed between April and June in 1984 through the uncompacted fill which made up part of the Alpine Way. It was made with AC pipes with super tight joints. These joints were not designed to resist pull-out forces, and the slope the water main was constructed on or in was marginally stable. So that meant that these joints could separate and or the pipe could break, leading to a leakage of water into the surrounding ground, causing further instability.
Did any of that decision-making process, was any of that further explained as to why one would therefore choose that piping?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there a better alternative?
There was, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the water main was designed and constructed by employees of KT1. The construction started before approval was granted,
Shocker.
as is becoming a theme, which meant that the National Parks and Wildlife Service issued a stop work order until approval was given.
But approval was still ultimately given for something that...
Retrospectively, yeah.
But also that wasn't the best option, and could part of that be because, it's like, we've already laid
It's
some of the
already underway.
we've already laid some of the infrastructure. We can't possibly change that to the right infrastructure without having to tear it all entirely up and, yeah.
The approval documents were submitted, but there were no details about the backfilling of the trench, the hydrants and air valves, or the bedding materials which were to be used in the course of the construction. So they were missing some details there.
Yeah, I'm like, hang on, so what did they detail?
Yeah. The plans were approved by the Clerk of Works from the National Parks and Wildlife Service in April 1984. He noted, particular emphasis shall be placed on the consolidation of backfill along the top bank of the road. The area below is a slip zone, and a build-up of water in a soft trench could increase risk of movement. However, he relied on the engineers from KT1 and did not request a geotechnical report or get any help from any National Park staff with engineering qualifications.
Okay.
So he said, yep, this is approved. Be mindful of this, but then there was no
And he himself
follow-up.
was an engineer, right?
I don't think he necessarily was, no.
Oh, okay.
The water main route was planned to travel in a north-south direction between Karinya and Shus lodges because that area, being a reserve, was not subleased to anybody.
Yeah.
The configuration of the Shus bend where the proposed Alpine Way water main turned from the east-west direction along the road to the north-south direction down to Bobuck Lane. So the configuration of that bend and the use of restraints for that bend to keep it in place was left to the installation crew to decide. So there was some talk in the inquest of should it have been a 90-degree bend or two 45-degree bends.
Ah.
So with two 45-degree bends, you've obviously got less
Curvature.
angle.
Yeah.
Yeah. The person supervising this work was not an engineer and did not have any detailed design drawings to draw on. So he relied on the experience he had gained in his involvement with the earlier upgrade of Thredbo's water supply system.
Okay. Oh, so he's got some experience. So
yeah, but he doesn't have any specific drawings to say this is what you need to do.
Which just like baffles me that would that not have been required for approval?
You would think so.
Okay. It's like someone's just gone along with like a pencil. I mean, like, it's going to go kind of here.
Yeah, make it happen. The supervisor could not remember how he configured the Shus bend.
Of course.
And there were no as-is drawings of the water main.
Seems an oversight.
Yes. Several plans of the Thredbo village water supply system were prepared soon after the installation of the Alpine Way water main, all of which showed an approximately 90 to 100-degree angle at the Shus bend.
But that is just we think this is what's there.
Yeah, basically. The Shus bend was completely encased with a concrete thrust block to prevent separation of the joints and pipe movement. But this also meant that any flexibility of the joints was removed.
Right. So it's going to be more prone to like cracking rather than just bending.
Yeah.
It's just going to break entirely. All the geotechnical engineers who gave evidence at the inquest agreed that the Alpine Way embankment where the landslide occurred was marginally stable and that its marginal stability could be adversely affected by water.
And by marginal stability, you mean like it's at risk of sliding?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
They also agreed that pipeline system like the one that was used in the water main should not be used in a marginally stable embankment which was subject to movement, especially in proximity to an essentially urban development.
It's now like just the irony of we need to improve this urban development by having this water main here.
Yes, which leads to more issues with the urban development. Because it's one government department saying, we need this, for fire safety.
Yeah.
And then a company then being like, okay, well, this is our land to deal with.
Yeah.
Sure, we'll put in a water main.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then in another scenario, we could be sitting here talking about an inquest about a fire.
Yeah, burning down the whole thing.
Thredbo village.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
agreed. But it's just that, like...
It's the irony of it. Yeah, for sure.
The clerk of works who approved the construction did not give any attention to the possible adverse effect of leakage of the water main on the stability of the Alpine Way.
Yeah, but most people assume that the pipeline is watertight, right?
Yes.
I mean, that would be my first assumption.
Yeah.
But he didn't even think about the fact that it
Might not
leak.
be, yeah.
He also didn't think about the danger posed by a collapse of the Alpine Way caused by a leak from the water main saturating the surrounding ground.
Do you think that was overly foreseeable at the time?
Well, it says here that he thought that a leak would lead to subsidence rather than a landslide.
I'm sorry.
Are they not almost one and the same?
But, subsidence is just when, the ground moves a little bit, but it doesn't fall off.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one leads to the other, right? But there has been multiple landslides. Yeah. There was at least the Winter House and then that 1978 landslide, both of which occurred from water issues.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so there is some foreseeability there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the coroner said that the water main should never have been constructed in the Alpine Way fill embankment.
Should never have been put in that particular location?
Should never have location.
It's the location that's the problem.
Yes.
Okay, because I'm like, well, we did say that it was possibly necessary.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
but
think
it's
also
put in
was
the fill embankment, which is unstable. And they know it's unstable because there's been several landslides.
Could they have built it with better construction and still put it in the same location?
No.
They would have had to rebuild the whole road first.
Yeah, okay.
That's the issue.
And like the reason they picked that location was because it was a reserve and no one was leased in that area, so they could do whatever they wanted with it.
Yeah, because they wouldn't have had to kick someone else out of their property or
to put the
disturb
water main
other
under.
people. Yeah. So they put it in there.
Being like, this is easy.
This is the easiest for now, the very,
Yeah.
It's a very much short-term vision of being like, it's easy now, not really considering the long-term implications of what this could mean. Because if they built it somewhere else, and I don't know the layout, but like that's the worst possible place to build it is underneath or in the embankment of an unstable
area
road that is already prone and has had several landslides.
Yeah.
And that they're already having issues about who's going to potentially reconstruct it, knowing that it needs to be reconstructed.
Yeah.
Since the coroner concluded that a leak from the water main was the likely cause of the saturation which triggered the landslide, he viewed the approval and construction of the water main to have been causally related to the deaths which resulted.
Right. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but...
Yes, it's not the whole issue.
But it's a contributory factor.
Yes.
Yeah.
So now we'll go on to the Winterhouse retaining wall construction. So the Winterhouse corner was a recognised traffic hazard. The road was narrow and blind, and the dish drain on the uphill side became muddy and boggy. The dish drain was a soil depression along which water flowed, mainly to the east from the high point of the Winterhouse corner until the drain entered culvert 137.
So it's just a gutter.
Essentially, like it was it wasn't like a trench, it wasn't a proper gutter, it was in an area of
drainage,
soil drainage.
Yeah. Nothing fancy.
No.
Okay.
In 1992, the National Parks and Wildlife Service district engineer responsible for the Alpine Way formed the view that the area around the Winterhouse corner was unsafe for traffic. He proposed that the road be widened with a retaining wall to retain that widened road. The draftsman who was engaged to design the retaining wall specialised in road engineering work and worked on contract for the National Parks Service. He was not an engineer but had accumulated some engineering knowledge about the stability of the road since he had previously been employed by the Department of Main Roads and had worked on the Alpine Way.
And they knew that it was not stable.
Yes. There was no geotechnical report obtained to assess the possible effect on the surrounding environment of the construction of the retaining wall.
No reports. Gosh, the 70s must have been a wild time.
This was the 90s.
Oh, shit.
Funding issues stopped the wall from being built at the time it was designed. Some form of design appears to be finished in about 1995, but construction on the wall did not start until January 1997.
Yeah.
A few months before the landslide. The designed retaining wall was about 117 metres in length. Its height above ground level depended on the height of the slope that was being retained, but did not exceed 2.5 metres. It consisted of prefabricated concrete panels slotted into position between I-beams, which were positioned about 2.5 metres apart.
So a pretty standard retaining wall, but also a pretty reasonable sized one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Seems like it was reasonably long, like over 100 metres in length.
Yeah. And 2 metres tall.
That's a pretty big retaining wall.
At its highest point above ground,
Yeah.
While the wall was designed to retain the hillside uphill to its south, a drainage trench beneath the wall was designed to receive and remove surface and subsurface water that flowed from the slope above the wall. It collected the water that had been previously collected by the old dish drains. Mm-hmm. So they did have a replacement for those. The draftsman designed a 2-pipe system and the concept of the drainage trench, but did not provide specific design parameters for the trench itself. He also provided no construction guide, leaving those matters as engineering detail to be dealt with on-site or by the design or other engineers to whom he reported.
I really want to know if this is common practice where you just kind of like semi-design something and then be like, whoever's installing it, you make some choices.
Well, I think in this case, because he's a draftsman, not an engineer, like he would have been going to the scope of his own knowledge.
Yeah.
And then he's expecting that the engineers who's he's submitting these plans to
would blanks.
would do the extra detail that needs to be done.
Yeah.
When the construction phase started, the draftsman arranged for a local officer of the Snowy Mountains Engineering Corporation to inspect the site and carry out foundation testing. The report included a handwritten note. As discussed at the time this testing was commissioned, I suggest you pay particular attention to the influence of groundwater, as the stability of your slope may be particularly sensitive in this parameter.
Yep.
So yet another person saying, hey, you need to be careful of drainage and water. It's going to impact your slope.
The stability of your slope. Yeah.
Yep. In the period before and during the construction of the retaining wall, the draftsman was on extended leave. An engineer was seconded from the Snowy Mountains Engineering Corporation to supervise the construction. The first part of construction was to cut into the slope, during which it was found that a section of the slope in the area of the Schuss Spring was too wet to remain rigid when cut. So to counteract this, sheet piling was hammered into the slope to support it before being removed once the wall was finished. It's just there as a temporary measure.
Stack something in front of it, it holds it, and then you slip it out later.
Yeah. After the slope was cut, the drainage trench was dug, then holes bored into the floor of the trench for the steel I-beams to be put in. And then they had concrete poured into those holes to secure the I-beams in place.
But which then is also impacting the water flow?
In a way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
In the case of 4 of the 50 holes, the ground was too sloppy and wet for the hole to retain its integrity. So essentially the hole was just collapsing in on itself.
Yeah.
Way too sloppy and wet.
So metal sleeves with a spiral corrugation were inserted into the holes, and the water in them pumped out before the concrete was poured in. When the wall was deconstructed in December 1998, so after the landslide, 2 features of the floor of the trench were found. The floor of the trench had 2 levels. The lower level tended to carry the water of the trench, and at a level away from where the I-beams and their concrete surrounds entered the ground. The second feature was that a portion of the floor around a few of the I-beams was covered with a layer of cement, thought to be because of accidental spillage of cement during the pouring of the concrete for the I-beams. This meant that water may not have been able to pass beneath the concrete.
Yeah. Is that because it was wet? They drained out water, then they poured in the concrete. Does it set that well, even if you drained out the excess water?
Yeah, it's not particularly porous, not as much as soil is. So the issue with the 2 levels of the trench means that you've got some pooling at one area. And then the other issue where they've got concrete on the floor of the trench means the water isn't as able to sort of drain away naturally. Yeah. It's just sitting there.
Yeah. But is that because of the way they constructed it? Was that as they designed, or is that an unintended consequence of their construction?
Unintended, because they've got accidental spillage of that cement across the floor when it should have just been confined to where the I-beams were.
Yeah.
No one associated with the construction of the retaining wall appears to have known about the existence of the water main, which ran parallel with the retaining wall on the other side of the road for more than half of its length.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Turns out there wasn't much documentation of the water main.
That means that when they were constructing it, could they not have just accidentally come across the water main?
No, it was on the other side of the road. So it wouldn't have impacted their construction necessarily.
Okay.
But it is a source of water. It's kind of right there. There was no geotechnical study done to assess the impact of the plan on groundwater and stability in the area. The coroner stated that it seemed unusual that the National Parks and Wildlife Service had used a geotechnical engineer to advise on the stability of the Alpine Way, yet assumed it was safe to conduct major work along that road without getting specific advice. They got the engineering opinion about the road itself, but didn't bother when it came to stuff they were doing right next to the road.
Yeah, essentially below the road.
So the last part I'll go through is the engineering cause. So this is where the coroner went into what was the cause of this landslide.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So the inquest defined a landslide as the movement of a mass of rock, debris, or earth down a slope. Engineers use the expression trigger to describe some change of a material nature that has occurred, which resulted in the landslide happening at the time it did.
Yeah.
The experts in the inquest agreed that there were several factors involved in causing the landslide. the construction and upgrading of the Alpine Way. So downslope loose fill, consisting of topsoil, weathered material, boulders, tree stumps, logs, and vegetation, was used and not compacted, meaning that the slope had marginal fragility.
So loose
Bits.
Yeah, like not properly compacted road.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it was designed for occasional use during the construction.
Yeah.
Do enough work that's
Yeah.
required.
Yeah. Why would you do more if it's not going to be used
Yeah.
after a certain amount of time?
Yeah. And also an increase in the groundwater pressure in the slope above Corinna in the material placed there during the Alpine Way construction or upgrading, caused by the construction of the Winterhouse retaining wall or a leaking joint in the water pipe laid in uncompacted fill adjacent to the Schuss Lodge near the top of where the slope failed.
Yeah.
The slope was subject to movement in both a horizontal and vertical direction. The vertical movement resulted from settlement of the uncompacted material. As over time and it rains, you get some water in it and it compacts.
Yeah.
The downslope or horizontal movement resulted from the normal application of geotechnical forces operating in downhill slopes in uncompacted material.
So essentially, because it's on a slope, when it's moving down, it's therefore moving out
Yeah,
as well.
essentially.
Yeah.
Post-landslide investigations revealed cracks or separations, indicating movement in the slopes surrounding the Munjara culvert, the Schuss culvert, and a cement rock drain below the Schuss car park. Cracks in fill along the Alpine Way were also noted. Before the Thredbo area was developed, the site of the landslide had at least one prior landslide, referred to as the primary landslide, which occurred hundreds of years ago. The primary landslide resulted in the slope where the Alpine Way and Corinna were later constructed being unstable before the construction of the Alpine Way or any lodges.
They were basically doomed from the outset.
Yes, they were.
Never going to work.
Yeah. It may have worked as just the Alpine Way as a construction road. Even then, it would have been in danger of collapsing.
I understand the purpose of why this road was built,
Yeah.
but it seems like a lot of pushing shit uphill, to be honest. Like, they wanted to divert the water. Right? This is the original purpose of all of this, and it's just...
constructing the Snowy Mountain hydroelectric.
which is basically trying to redirect water where it doesn't want to go.
Yeah.
It's like a whole lot of man-made
Oh, yeah.
issues that have like snowballed.
But if it's a 1 in 100 year landslide, does that make
But it's
it?
not a 1 in 100 year landslide.
Well, it happened 100 years ago.
The initial landslide. Yeah, back before
Yeah,
anyone
yeah.
tampered with anything.
But the reality is we don't know that. Like, there were obviously so many landslides since then as well. They
Yeah.
just aren't necessarily documented. Like, landslides were
true.
happening at least once every decade.
Yeah.
So that slope, prior to any construction, before anything was done to it, was also very sensitive to any build-up in groundwater pressures.
Yeah.
Because obviously the more water you have.
Yeah, of
The more it
course.
slumps
Yeah.
because it's wet and it's uncompacted.
So the existence of this primary landslide was not recorded prior to investigations into the 1997 landslide. So essentially no one really looked properly at the slope before they built the Alpine Way. And so they never realised that there had been this big landslide
Okay.
100 years before.
So no one knew that at the time that they were
Yeah.
constructing. Okay.
And again, they wouldn't have looked into all of that.
No.
Because it was never meant to be used for the purpose that it was. So they're
Yeah.
just like, we'll just do a slap,
Yeah.
haphazard job because that's what we need it for.
Yeah.
And that's just snowballed.
The safety factor of the landslide site was low. All experts agreed that the change required to trigger the landslide was very small.
Yeah.
Like, you could have had a minor leak and it could have happened. It didn't take much for this to happen.
But it wasn't naturally occurring either.
No. The landslide extended from the edge of the Alpine Way to just above the base of the Corinna slope. It was 5 to 6 metres deep at its deepest, thinning to about 1 or 2 metres deep immediately behind Corinna. The first component of the landslide site was confined to the southern part of the landslide area, mainly between Corinna and the Alpine Way. The second component was a mudflow/debris tongue, which extended from Corinna to just behind Wolf's Lair at the northern portion of the landslide site.
Just before you said Corinna slope, Is Corinna a slope as well as a lodge?
No, I think it's the slope that Corinna was on.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where I'm getting confused.
There was the main sort of landslide,
Yeah.
which was basically from Alpine Way to Corinna.
Yeah.
And then the secondary mud flow
Slump.
that happened
Yeah.
because of that. It was agreed in the inquest that the slope failure occurred because of groundwater changes within the mass which failed.
Yeah.
Which, whether that was the water main and the retaining wall or both of them.
Which I'll come to.
Yeah, cool.
It was water that triggered this whole event.
Yes.
I'll touch on how that water came to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the summary of this section is that there was a lot of development happening in Thredbo over many years. Not a lot of it was documented. Not a lot of it was approved before it was started. There was a lot of geotechnical reports that just never happened. And like there were a few people who were obviously raising things as issues, but they never went anywhere.
Yeah.
No one ever did anything about them.
And then there was miss or lack of communication between various departments or organisations
Yes.
as well.
Quite a few people noted on a number of occasions over the years that there were issues with the site, with potential water impacting the site.
Yeah.
But yeah, nothing happened.
It's almost like the bystander effect, right?
A little bit, yeah. Yeah. It was like lots of people being like, this is terrible, this is going to be a
but
bad
no one doing
idea. And
anything
then
about
not.
it.
Yeah.
Or everyone assuming that, okay, well, I've raised it with whoever is building this thing.
Yeah.
They'll do something about it.
Yeah.
And then they don't.
All right. Well, next time we'll come back and we'll chat a little bit more about how that water came to be there. And I'm also going to touch on the rescue efforts that the coroner commended and said were the best of a really terrible situation. And then we'll touch on some recommendations that the coroner also gave.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.